My parents hid a $5 million trust fund from me while I struggled to make rent, and when the truth came out, they sat there, unable to meet my gaze. I thought my 26th birthday would be like any other, just another year of scraping by, building my life from the ground up in the heart of Chicago. But that night, a simple question from my grandfather shattered everything. It wasn't just about a birthday dinner. It was about a betrayal so deep that it stole millions from my future and decades from my past. My 26th birthday was intended to be a pleasant occasion, commemorating another year of hard-earned independence. Instead, a single simple question from my grandfather shattered my entire world, revealing a grave betrayal that had stolen millions from my future and decades from my history. Before that night, I was Iris, a graphic artist in downtown Chicago who was just trying to make things work. I lived what I believed was a very regular existence, sharing a little rundown 2-bedroom apartment with my beautiful roommate Olivia. Even when we shared the rent, it was prohibitively expensive. But that was simply city living, correct? Our apartment, however, had character, with mismatched furniture we'd discovered over the years and walls covered in paintings I adored. Despite having a rich grandfather, I was really proud of making my own way. My parents, David and Rachel, had a very happy upper-middle-class existence in the suburbs, with a 5-bedroom house, a pool, and 2 costly holidays per year. I imagined they were doing well because my father was a senior at an insurance business, and my mother worked in real estate. They never gave financial assistance, instead emphasizing the importance of working for your goals. Developing character. When I graduated from art school 4 years ago, drowning in nearly $70,000 in student loans, they practically slapped me on the head. While other friends received assistance with down payments or a few months' rent from their parents, I received a copy of Dave Ramsey and another lesson on character development via suffering. I never disliked them for it. Not then, anyway. I was really desperate to prove myself capable, but there were moments when things were so tight that I questioned why they seemed so hesitant to assist, especially when they'd arrive in a brand new luxury automobile or brag about their most recent kitchen overhaul. It didn't quite add up. Grandpa Edward was always an enigma. He'd started from scratch in real estate development and established one of the Midwest's largest property corporations. He was severe, intimidating, and rarely showed up for family events. When he did, everyone walked on eggshells around him. However, for some reason, he always had a soft spot for me. On the rare instances when we did speak, he asked serious questions about my design work and sincerely listened. My cousin Sophia was the only one in our generation who appeared to benefit from the family wealth. She possessed a trust fund that allowed her to live a very luxurious existence. She never worked a day in her life and was constantly uploading images of exotic locales and high-end eateries. And at family gatherings, she'd always find a way to bring up her most recent buying spree or vacation, almost as if she was attempting to underline the gap between us. The week before my birthday had been very difficult. My design firm lost a key client, and I was one of 5 people let go. I began to panic. I only had enough cash to cover about 2 months' rent, and finding a new work in a competitive area seemed impossible. So when my folks called and insisted on taking me out for an expensive birthday dinner, I tried to decline. I proposed something easy, like takeaway from my apartment, but they were adamant. 27 is special, Iris, they explained. It deserves a proper celebration. In retrospect, their insistence makes twisted sense. There had been clues, small things I'd overlooked, such as when I proposed considering returning to school for my master's degree and my father instantly shot it down, stating I already had enough student debt, or how my mother would swiftly shift the subject anytime I addressed my financial difficulties. There were quiet phone conversations that ended the instant I walked into a room, as well as a weird tension whenever Grandpa Edward's name was spoken. A few months ago, I discovered my mother looking at properties in Panama online. When I asked if they were planning a vacation, she slammed her laptop down, claiming she was only daydreaming. My father had also been making strange comments about how we might not see each other as much in the future because they were planning to travel more. Olivia surprised me with a handcrafted card and a small potted plant for my birthday. We'd been friends since college, and she knew better than anyone how hard I'd worked just to get by. As I prepared for dinner that night, she assisted me in putting together an outfit that looked good while remaining within the confines of my restricted wardrobe. I had no clue that in just a few hours, everything I thought I knew about my family would be broken beyond repair, or that the financial difficulties I had been experiencing for years were absolutely needless. As I applied my mascara and put on my only acceptable pair of earrings, I had no idea I was about to discover the most agonizing treachery. My parents chose a restaurant where the menu had no prices. That instantly made me uncomfortable. Crystal chandeliers, spotless white linens, the whole 9 yards. The hostess brought us to a table in the center of the dining room, where my parents had already reserved champagne. I felt extremely out of place in my plain black dress and the heels I had worn to job interviews for the previous 3 years. My mother, on the other hand, was dressed in a designer clothing I'd never seen before, complete with a necklace that most likely cost more than my rent. My father wore an exquisite suit with gold cufflinks that gleamed in the light. The talk felt forced from the start. They asked surface-level queries regarding my job search, but swiftly changed the subject when I indicated genuine concern. Instead, they kept the conversation safe, discussing a movie they had watched and updates on distant relatives I hardly knew. Following our order, they presented me with my gifts: a luxury pocketbook and a scarf. They were stunning but shockingly modest for the restaurant. As I thanked them, my mother started into a typical lecture about financial responsibility and the value of good credit. I was halfway through my entree, nodding along to another of my father's college memories, when the mood in the restaurant abruptly changed. People at nearby tables straightened. Staff became much more attentive. I turned to see what had caused the change and quickly noticed him. Grandpa Edward. He had arrived with his assistant, Claire, a bright woman in her 40s who was never more than a few steps away from him. At 82, Edward remained an imposing figure, tall, straight-backed, with a full head of silver hair. He wore a wonderfully fitted suit that probably cost more than my annual income, and his very presence demanded attention without him saying anything. My parents paused in the middle of the talk, their faces ranging from surprise to nearly fearful. My father rose hurriedly, almost knocking over his water glass. "Edward, this is unexpected," he said, his voice raised above normal. "We didn't think you'd make it." My grandfather absolutely disregarded him. His severe demeanor relaxed as he neared our table. "Happy birthday, Iris," he said, leaning down and kissing my cheek. His fragrance smelled rich, like leather and cedar. 27 years. It's hard to believe how quickly time passes. "Thank you, Grandpa," I said, grateful that he remembered. "It means a lot that you came." He took the empty seat beside me, leaving Claire standing, tablet in hand, ready to take notes. "I wanted to check in on how things are going," he added, looking at my face with intelligence eyes that missed nothing. "Claire tells me the quarterly reports for your investment portfolio look strong. The trust should be performing well in this market." I blinked in confusion. Investment portfolio? Trust. A tiny furrow formed between his brows. "Yes. The trust fund established when you were born. You turned 25 2 years ago, so everything should have been transferred to your control by now." He talked as if this was common knowledge. My folks became suddenly very interested in their plates. My mother's knuckles had turned white around the fork. "I think there might be some confusion," I answered softly, my gaze shifting between my grandfather and parents. "I don't have a trust fund." Edward's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes sharpened. "Of course you do. Your cousins as well, though yours was the largest. $5 million initially, plus growth, managed by your parents until your 20th birthday, when control was to transfer to you." As I tried to understand what he was saying, the restaurant around us faded away. I had no idea there was a $5 million trust fund. That made no sense. "And the apartment in Gold Coast," Edward said, his voice cheerful, but his gaze now riveted on my parents. "Is it comfortable?" "I selected that building specifically because of the security and the views of the lake." "What apartment?" I asked, barely above a whisper. The hush that ensued was deafening. My father had turned pale, and my mother appeared ill. Edward's demeanor remained serene, but there was a frightening stillness about him, like the moment before a storm. "You don't know about the apartment?" he asked. It was not a question. "The 2-bedroom corner unit in the lakeside tower purchased 2 years ago as your 20th birthday present." I shook my head carefully, trying to figure out what was going on. Edward turned to my parents with deliberate slowness, his voice sinking to a quiet tone that was more terrifying than if he had yelled. "Then where did the money go?" My father began to talk with a quiver in his voice. "Edward, there's been a misunderstanding. We can explain everything." "I sincerely hope so," my grandfather said, his tone indicating that he didn't feel there was any explanation that would satisfy him. He turned to his assistant. "Claire, please call Martin and have him meet us here right away." "Already done, sir," Claire responded quickly. "He was at a dinner nearby and should arrive within 10 minutes. I've also contacted security at the office to pull all the relevant financial records." The other guests were staring openly, as if the drama at our table was more exciting than their pricey dinners. A waiter stood close, hesitating whether to approach. My mother stretched across the table for my hand, but I backed away, a nasty feeling rising in the pit of my stomach. "Iris, sweetheart, this isn't how we wanted to tell you." "Tell me what?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain composed. "That I have a trust fund and an apartment I never knew about, or that somehow you kept them from me?" My father looked uncomfortably around at the other diners. "This isn't the place to discuss family matters." "I agree," Edward remarked coldly. "Claire, please arrange for a private room." He looked at me, his expression softening slightly. "Iris, I promise you will get answers tonight. All of them." As Claire spoke softly to the restaurant manager, I sat startled, trying to connect the previous year's financial struggles with what I had just discovered. Why would my parents withhold this from me? What had they done with the money that was purportedly intended for me? How could I ever trust them again? The restaurant's private dining room featured dark wood paneling and a large table that could seat 12, making our tiny group feel even more isolated. Edward sat at the head of the table, with me on his right. My parents sat across from me, looking as if they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Claire positioned herself at the door, tablet in hand, face professionally blank. We were soon joined by Martin Thornton, my grandfather's longtime attorney, a balding man with piercing eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He carried a leather briefcase and gently placed it on the table. "I took the liberty of bringing the original trust documents," Edward said, "as well as the most recent financial statements." Edward nodded. Martin cleared his throat and addressed me directly. "Good. Let's start at the beginning for Iris's benefit. When you were born, your grandfather established a trust fund in your name with an initial deposit of $5 million. The terms were straightforward. The trust would be managed by your parents as trustees until your 25th birthday, at which point control would transfer entirely to you. The only stipulations were that the money could be used for your education, health, and general welfare prior to your 25th birthday, with all expenditures documented and approved." I looked at him in bewilderment. "And no one thought to tell me about this?" "Your parents were instructed to inform you about the trust when you turned 18, Martin said, looking at my father and mother. "Based on your reaction, I gather that didn't happen." "It did not," Edward answered, his voice tense with repressed wrath. "Nor apparently did the transfer of assets at 25. He turned to Martin. "What is the current value of Iris's trust?" Martin removed several documents from his briefcase and set them on the table. According to the most recent statement from 3 months ago, the trust had grown to approximately $8.3 million. This includes the original principal plus investment growth, minus authorized expenditures for college tuition and the purchase of the Gold Coast apartment 2 years ago. $8.3 million. The number looked impossible. While I was working overtime and foregoing meals to pay the rent, millions of dollars belonged to me and were intended to be used for my advantage. "I want to see proof of all withdrawals from the trust over the past 5 years, Edward said. Martin. As the attorney presented additional documents, my father finally spoke up. "Edward, we can explain. There were investments that didn't perform as expected. The money is just temporarily allocated elsewhere." "Allocated where exactly?" Edward inquired, his demeanor menacing. My mom jumped in. "David, just tell the truth." She looked at Edward, tears in her eyes. "There were some financial difficulties after the recession. We had to make some adjustments by stealing from your daughter." Edward's voice was freezing cold. "It wasn't stealing," my father insisted weakly. "We are her parents. We were looking out for her best interests. I have found my voice. By letting me struggle with student loans and a tiny apartment with a roommate while you lived in a 4-bedroom house with a pool? By watching me stress about making rent while you bought new cars and went on luxury vacations? How exactly was that in my best interest?" Claire softly put a glass of water in front of me. I didn't realize I was shaking until I attempted to take it up and almost spilled it. Martin was perusing the financial documents with a rising frown. There appeared to be numerous unauthorized withdrawals beginning approximately 7 years ago. Large sums transferred to personal accounts belonging to David and Rachel. He turned around, his face gloomy. "Based on my preliminary review, it appears that all but approximately $150,000 has been diverted from the trust." The room became silent. $5 million was lowered to $150,000. I felt physically unwell. "Where's the money now?" Edward inquired, his placid demeanor belying the rage in his eyes. My father gazed down at his hands. Some of it went to pay off our mortgage, some for cars, renovations to the house, investments in Rachel's real estate business, vacations, whispered my mom. The house in Florida. Memories flooded my head, terrible in their new context. When I voiced concern about the payments, my parents refused to help with my security deposit for my first apartment after college, telling me that my student loan burden was important character building. My mother proudly displayed her new Mercedes as I rode the bus to work since I couldn't afford vehicle payments. All while they had access to millions of funds intended for me. You let me struggle, I muttered, scarcely rising above a whisper. All those years, all those sleepless nights worrying about money, you watched me work 2 jobs during college, you saw how stressed I was about being laid off last week. My voice grew sterner as I vented my frustration. And you had my money the whole time. You were living off my trust fund while letting me think I was on my own. It wasn't like that, my mother said, tears flowing down her cheeks. We always intended to pay it back. Things just got out of hand. Out of hand? I asked incredulously. You stole nearly $5 million from me. Edward put a steadying hand on my arm. Claire, please call Detective Ramirez. I believe he's still with the Financial Crimes Unit. Edward, no, my father screamed. There's no need to involve the police. This is a family matter. Theft is a criminal matter, Edward said coldly. Particularly at this scale, please. My mother begged. We can solve this. We can sell the house and automobiles to pay it off. Edward glanced at me and said, Iris, this is ultimately your decision. They stole from you. Whether or not to press charges is entirely up to you. I stared across the table at my parents, whom I had always trusted entirely. The astonishment was giving way to a profound, hurting sense of betrayal, which I knew would never fully heal. I need time to think, I said. I can't process all of this right now. Edward nodded. A reasonable request. He turned to Martin. In the meantime, I want all of their assets frozen. Nothing happens without my approval, and I want a full forensic audit of every dime that has left that trust. Already initiated, Claire stated from her position near the door. The team will work through the night if necessary. And the apartment? Martin asked. Have the locks been replaced immediately? New keys will only be given to Iris, Edward directed. My father made a final desperate attempt. Edward, be reasonable. Where should we go? My grandfather confronted him with a cold stare. You've bought a 5-bedroom house with stolen money, enjoy it while you can. The real estate fraud unit will be particularly interested in how a trust fund purchased property was titled in your names. The restaurant manager tentatively knocked on the door, peeking his head inside to see if we needed anything further. The tension in the room appeared to have its own gravitational pull. Just the check, Edward remarked dismissively. We're finished here. As the manager retreated, I looked around the table at these people who were my family, wondering how I had never seen the truth before. My parents, unable to meet my gaze. My grandfather, steady as a rock beside me. Claire and Martin, efficient and professional in the face of this family implosion. Nothing would ever be the same after tonight. The foundations of my life had been exposed as lies, and I had no idea what would remain standing when the dust fell. The car ride home was silent and oppressive. I had denied Edward's invitation to stay at one of his houses, preferring the familiar comfort of my own apartment, no matter how shabby it was. As the cab drove away, I noticed my parents standing transfixed on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, suddenly seeming small and ancient in the glaring streetlight. When I stepped through my apartment door, Olivia saw my face and knew something was dreadfully wrong. She led me to the couch, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and patiently waited while I struggled to find words. My parents stole $5 million from me, I finally said, the words sounding absurd even as they left my mouth. I told her everything, the stories spilling out in disjointed pieces, the trust fund I had no idea existed, the apartment that was supposed to be mine, the years of financial struggle that had been entirely unnecessary. As I spoke, the shock gave way to a bone-deep rage I had never felt before. I applied for food stamps last year, I said, my voice breaking. I was eating ramen for dinner 4 nights a week to save money, and they were using my trust fund to remodel their kitchen and buy luxury cars. Olivia held my hand tightly as I cycled through shock, rage and grief. At one point, she made tea. That grew cold on the coffee table. My phone buzzed constantly with texts and calls from my parents, which I ignored. The only message I responded to was from Edward, who confirmed my safety and asked if I needed anything. Claire called the next morning with an update. Edward's legal team was moving quickly, and they had already confirmed that the house in Florida, my parents' primary residence, and both of their vehicles were purchased with money from my trust. A forensic accountant was tracking down every withdrawal and transfer. The preliminary findings indicate that approximately $150,000 remains of the original trust, Claire remarked with ease. Most of the money went to real estate purchases, luxury items, and some high-risk investments that performed poorly. The days that followed were a fog. I took sick leave from my new job search, unable to focus on anything other than the current problem. Edward sent a car every day to take me to appointments with attorneys, financial advisors, and eventually a therapist specializing in family trauma. A week after my birthday, we discovered that my parents had purchased plane tickets to Panama 3 days before my birthday dinner, and they had planned to leave the country immediately after the celebration, apparently realizing that Edward could discover their deception at any time. The only reason they hadn't fled already was that they needed to maintain appearances until after my birthday, which they knew Edward might attend. My father's siblings backed him, claiming that Edward was overreacting to what was just terrible money management, while my mother's side was more divided, with her sister calling me directly to apologize for her sister's actions. My cousin Sophia, who arrived at my apartment unannounced one afternoon, looked uncharacteristically subdued. I always wondered why Uncle David and Aunt Rachel lived so well when Dad's and our trust funds were basically the same size, she admitted, sitting uncomfortably on my worn couch. I guess now we know. Sophia's trust had been properly maintained, but it was much less than mine had been. She had been careful with her money, making it last while flaunting a more humble lifestyle than social media showed. I was always jealous of how close you were with your parents, she confessed. My parents were always honest about the money, but they were never truly there for me emotionally. I believed you had loving parents and were humble about your wealth. I never imagined they would steal from you. That talk marked the start of an unexpected connection with my cousin, a bright spot in the darkness that had consumed my life. Edward's team discovered that only about $150,000 of my original trust remained. The rest had been spent on my parents' lavish lifestyle or lost in bad investments. The house in Florida and their primary residence were both seized, as they had been purchased directly with trust fund money. The cars, the boat my father rarely used, and my mother's extensive jewelry collection, all documented and evaluated for potential recovery. Throughout it all, my parents made desperate attempts to contact me. As the legal consequences became clear, my father called from a hotel room, claiming they had nowhere to go. My mother sent long emails about how everything they did was ultimately for my benefit, though she never managed to explain exactly how their luxury lifestyle had helped me. Eventually, the media became aware of the story, and a small piece about Edward Harrington's family financial dispute was published in a business publication. Although I was not mentioned by name, the article hinted at significant misappropriation of trust fund assets by close family members, so I deleted all of my social media accounts. The worst part was the constant gnawing feeling of guilt that plagued me, despite being the victim. Had I somehow driven my parents to this? Should I have noticed something was wrong? Was I overreacting by allowing Edward's legal team to pursue them so aggressively? The therapist Edward had arranged for me explained that this was a common response for victims of familial betrayal, but understanding the psychology didn't make the feelings go away. After 3 weeks of living in a fog of legal meetings and mental agony, Edward invited me to dinner in his penthouse, which was unexpectedly warm and pleasant despite its evident opulence. He fixed us both drinks and dismissed the staff for the evening to allow us peace. "I want you to know that none of this is your responsibility," he added, gazing directly at me. "Your parents made their own decisions. They deceived not only you, but the faith you had in them." "I keep thinking I should have known," I confessed. "There were signs," Edward mentioned. "You had no reason to suspect your own parents of stealing from you. Especially when you didn't even know the money existed." That night, Edward showed me images I had never seen before. My grandmother, who died when I was too young to remember her. Edward as a young man working on his first project. And my mother as a youngster sitting on Edward's shoulders in a park. "Family is complicated," he added, his voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. "Your grandmother and I did not always agree on how to raise your mother. I was frequently excessively strict and focused on growing the business. Perhaps if I had been different, your mother would have had a better relationship with money. My parents had not only stolen from me, but also betrayed the father who had tried to secure his granddaughter's future. It was the closest thing to vulnerability I had ever seen from my grandfather, and it helped me understand that the betrayal had layers beyond my own pain. I agreed to meet with my parents 1 month after my birthday. The legal mediation was scheduled at Edward's attorney's office, A sleek space in a downtown high-rise that made my parents look even more out of place than they already did. My father's face was gaunt with dark circles under his eyes, and my mother's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. They had visibly aged in the past month. My parents had a single lawyer, a nervous-looking man who kept shuffling his papers. They were dressed in clothes I didn't recognize, more modest than their usual attire, and I later learned they had been forced to sell much of their designer wardrobe. The conference room was intimidatingly large for our small group, and Edward sat beside me with Martin and 2 other attorneys from his team nearby. The financial forensics team presented their findings with clinical precision, detailing the systematic draining of my trust over 7 years, which had begun with small amounts borrowed and escalated to major withdrawals. The money had funded their house purchase, cars, expensive vacations, my mother's failed attempt to start a luxury real estate agency, and my father's disastrous foray into day trading. As the evidence accumulated, my father's stance became increasingly defensive, while my mother merely gazed at the table, periodically wiping away tears. At the end of the presentation, Edward addressed my parents directly. The forensic accounting is completed. We know exactly where each dollar went. The only remaining question is whether this will be resolved civilly or criminally. My parents' attorney cleared his throat, saying, "My clients are willing to completely comply. They comprehend the seriousness of their misdeeds and want to make amends to the greatest extent feasible." "Amends?" I repeated, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "You stole my future. You watched me suffer while living on money that was intended for me. How do you intend to make amends for that?" My father could not meet my gaze. "Iris, we never intended for things to escalate this far. It began simply, with a little loan to help get through a difficult period. Then it was easier to take a little more and more. We convinced ourselves we earned it," my mother added quietly, "for raising you, and all the sacrifices we made as parents. We promised ourselves we'd pay it back before you knew." "And the apartment?" I inquired. "The one Grandpa purchased for me 2 years ago. What was your plan there?" They exchanged remorseful looks, and my father sighed deeply. "We were renting it out. The income was being deposited into our account. While I was sharing a small apartment with a roommate, they were collecting rent on a luxury house that was meant to be mine." Edward placed a steadying hand on my shoulder and addressed my parents. "These are your alternatives. Option 1. You sign over all remaining assets purchased with trust fund funds, fully cooperate with recovery attempts, and agree to a structured repayment schedule for items that cannot be retrieved immediately. In exchange, Iris agrees not to file criminal accusations." My folks nodded enthusiastically. "Option 2, Edward said, his voice sharpening. "If you continue to obfuscate and justify your activities, we will pursue criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and theft. The evidence is overwhelming. You'd both face considerable prison time." "We choose option 1, my father said quickly. "We'll cooperate completely." Edward stared at me. "Iris, the decision is yours." I observed my parents, who had reared me, tucked me in at night, and applauded at my graduations, but had also gradually plundered my inheritance while watching me suffer. The contrasting emotions were overwhelming. "I don't want them in prison," I finally responded. "But I do want every penny that can be recovered. And I want them to admit precisely what they did. Not only to me, but to the whole family." Over the next few hours, my parents signed document after document, transferring assets and agreeing to the terms Edward's team had outlined. By the end of the day, I legally owned their Florida home, which would be sold, and arrangements were made to recover as many of their possessions as possible for liquidation. When the attorneys left to make copies, I found myself alone with my parents for the first time since my birthday. "Why?" I inquired calmly. "I'd like to understand how you could achieve this." My mother grabbed for my hand, and this time, I didn't back away. "We got caught up in a lifestyle we couldn't afford. Your father made several poor investments early in our marriage, and we were constantly catching up to maintain appearances. When we had your faith, it seemed like a simple solution. Just enough to help us get ahead. But it never ended." "We have a problem with money," my father said, feeling sincerely ashamed for the first time. "With spending and status. We need assistance. Professional assistance. That does not excuse what we did to you, but it may help explain why. It wasn't enough. No explanation could ever be enough, but it was a start, a tiny gap in the wall of betrayal that separated us." 2 weeks later, I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment purchased with a portion of the recovered funds. It wasn't the luxury Gold Coast property that should have been mine, but it was mine, free and clear, with no mortgage or rent to worry about. Edward had assisted me in choosing it, insisting on security features and a good location near public transportation. With Edward's guidance, I began to learn about financial management. The recovered assets, including the Florida house and various liquidated possessions, amounted to just over $1 million, a fraction of the trust's value, but still a life-changing amount for someone who had been living paycheck to paycheck. While I was initially hesitant to accept help that felt like nepotism, Edward pointed out that getting me the interview was all he had done. Earning the position was entirely up to me. A new job opportunity came through a connection of Edward's, a position at a reputable design firm with higher pay and advancement potential than my previous job. As spring turned to summer, I began to establish new routines and boundaries. I allowed limited contact with my parents, accepting brief phone calls but declining their request to visit. They had moved into a small rental apartment and were both in therapy for financial addiction, a term I had never heard before but seemed to describe their behavior accurately. Edward and I grew closer, and our weekly dinners became a fixture in my calendar. He taught me about investments and business with the same precision and attention to detail that had made him successful, and I began to see past his gruff exterior to the complex, caring man beneath. Claire, surprisingly, also became something of a friend. Having worked for Edward for over 12 years, she had stories about him that humanized him in ways I had never expected. She also proved to be an excellent mentor for professional development, guiding me through office politics and career planning with her characteristic efficiency. The most unexpected was the re-emergence of Jake, a college friend with whom I had lost touch. He contacted me after seeing me at a coffee shop near my new apartment, and our reconnection felt like finding an anchor in stormy seas. He had no connection to my family drama, no preconceived notions about who I should be, and with him, I could just be Iris, not the victim of a high-profile family betrayal. As summer faded into fall, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in months: hope. Not just for financial stability, but for rebuilding an authentically mine life based on truth rather than deception. 6 months after the revelation that changed everything, I found myself thriving in ways I could never have predicted. My position at the design firm had evolved from a basic graphic designer role to leading a small team working on a major rebranding project for a national client. Edward had helped me establish a proper financial foundation with the recovered funds, which had been carefully invested, with a portion set aside for immediate security. I now had a retirement account, health insurance that covered more than catastrophic emergencies, and an emergency fund that would sustain me for a full year if needed. For someone who had spent years counting pennies and fretting about unexpected expenses, the security was almost disorienting. I still hesitated before making simple purchases, my financial anxiety habits deeply ingrained, despite my improved circumstances. My parents continued to struggle with the consequences of their actions. They had been forced to downsize dramatically, moving from their 5-bedroom house to a small 2-bedroom apartment in a modest neighborhood. My father had taken a position at a small insurance agency, several steps down from his previous executive role, while my mother had surrendered her real estate license as part of the legal settlement and was working as an administrative assistant. The social consequences had been arguably the most difficult adjustment for them, as former acquaintances had withdrawn themselves once the story circulated through their social circle, and they were no longer invited to the country club gatherings and charity galas that had formerly been the focal point of their social calendar. After months of minimal contact, I agreed to meet them for coffee at a neutral location. They arrived early, noticeably apprehensive, with no gifts or overtures, other than a clear desire to reconnect. "We've been working with our therapist on making amends," my mother stated, her hands tightly wrapped around her coffee cup. "Not only to you, but to Edward, and to ourselves. We understand that we cannot undo what we've done. Separate accounts, strict budgets, accountability partners, we're establishing financial boundaries," my father added. "It's like recovering from any other addiction." I listened more than I spoke, seeing the changes in them. A humility that had never existed before. The absence of the designer brands and status symbols that had formerly been so important to their identity. Before we parted ways, my mother asked tentatively if we could have regular contact, perhaps over a monthly lunch, and I agreed to think about it, unwilling to commit but no longer wholly averse to the notion of a carefully formed relationship. Edward had a minor health scare in early fall, a warning from his doctor about his blood pressure that resulted in lifestyle changes and a reduced work schedule. The brush with mortality had softened him even more, making him more reflective about family relationships, despite the pain of betrayal. "Your grandmother always said that family was worth fighting for," he reminded me when we were eating supper each week. "Not worth sacrificing your self-respect or safety, but worth the effort of understanding and forgiveness when possible. Edward taught me not only about financial management, but also about resilience in the face of treachery. Despite being terribly saddened by my parents' conduct, he remained a constant presence in my life, never letting his dissatisfaction with them impair his connection with me. With Edward's encouragement, I started a small side business in graphic design consulting, working with startups that couldn't afford full-service agencies. The work was challenging and rewarding, allowing me to build something entirely on my own, independent of family connections or recovered funds. My confidence was growing not only professionally, but also personally, and the therapy sessions that had begun as crisis management had evolved into a valuable tool for examining patterns and building healthier relationships. I was learning to trust my own judgment again, to recognize that I had been a victim, not because I had failed, but because those I trusted had made terrible choices. An unexpected development occurred in the form of a surprise dinner organized by Edward 6 months to the day after my disastrous birthday. He reserved a private dining room at a restaurant even more posh than the one where our family had crumbled, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. When I arrived, I found not only Edward, but also Claire, Martin, my cousin Sophia, and even Jake gathering to celebrate what Edward referred to as my half-birthday. 6 months ago, your life changed in ways no one could have predicted, Edward remarked, raising a glass in salute. Tonight, we celebrate not what was lost, but what you have built from the ashes. After dinner, Edward handed me a little box containing a key and a deed to a new apartment, modest but secure, with a short commute to my office. The Gold Coast property was sold as part of the recovery efforts, he said. This one is all yours. Purchased with recovered monies, but chosen expressly for your current life, not the one that was taken from you. The gesture drove me to tears, not because of its monetary value, but because it symbolized a clean break with the past, a new beginning free of betrayal. My relationship with Sophia had evolved from a cautious connection to a genuine friendship, free of the artificial competition that had characterized our earlier interactions. We discovered shared interests and complementary personalities, and she had even invested in my side business, providing capital for expansion in exchange for a small equity stake, which Edward had helped structure to ensure fairness for both of us. I always thought you had the perfect family, she confessed over a lunch date. It's strange how we envied each other for things that weren't even real. Jake had become more than a friend in recent months. Our coffee dates had turned into dinner dates and long conversations that often lasted late into the evening, and he had been present through the worst of the aftermath without attempting to fix or minimize my pain, instead providing steady support and the occasional necessary distraction. When he kissed me for the first time on a walk along the lakefront near my new apartment, it seemed like I was crossing a threshold into a new part of my life, free of treachery. Our relationship was built on honesty. From the start, I used a portion of my recovered funds to establish a small mentorship program for young designers from disadvantaged backgrounds, providing scholarships for software training and professional development. Although the program was still in its early stages, helping others who faced financial barriers to creative careers gave me a sense of purpose that went beyond my personal experience. As autumn went to winter, I understood that, while betrayal will always be a part of my tale, it no longer dominated my everyday existence. I was creating something new, something authentic, based on the painful truth, rather than the comfortable lies. 1 year after the birthday that changed everything, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined. Not just financially comfortable, but emotionally stronger, with clearer boundaries and deeper, more honest connections than I had before the betrayal. The healing process had not been straightforward. There were still days when my wrath would flare up suddenly, and the recollection of those years of useless struggle would feel fresh and raw. But these times were becoming less common as I built a fuller life. My parents and I had established a cautious reconciliation process. We met monthly for lunch with clear boundaries and expectations, and they had shown genuine remorse by continuing their therapy and making small but consistent restitution payments that Edward's team had structured as part of their amends process. I never thought I would sit at a table with them again without feeling rage, I revealed to my therapist during one of our now bi-weekly sessions. It is not forgetting or even complete forgiveness yet, but it is something like peace. Edward's financial education had transformed my relationship with money, and I now manage my investments with confidence, understanding the balance between security and growth. The remaining trust funds, though much smaller than they should have been, were carefully managed to provide long-term stability while allowing me to live comfortably in the present. Despite the betrayal and the legal ramifications, Edward was still my grandfather and my parents' father, and our time together was limited and precious, even with the shadow of his past actions. Edward had a more serious health scare, which required a brief hospitalization, and the fragility of his death brought perspective to our family situation. During his recovery, I spent hours at his bedside, learning more about his early years, his relationship with my grandmother, his regrets, and his triumphs. These conversations helped me understand not only him, but also the complex family dynamics that had contributed to my parents' actions, though they were never excused. My design job had taken off, and my side business had grown to the point where I was considering turning it into a full-time venture. I had hired 2 junior designers to help with the increasing client load and a business manager to handle the administrative aspects that I had little interest in. The mentorship program had also expanded, with 5 young designers now receiving scholarships and professional guidance. Seeing them grow in confidence and skill gave me a sense of satisfaction unlike anything I had ever felt professionally. Jake and I had grown steadily closer, and our relationship, built on a foundation of transparency, was something I now recognized had been missing from most of my previous relationships, familial and romantic alike. He had his own apartment, but spent most nights at mine, and our lives intertwined in a way that felt natural and effortless. "Do you know what amazes me the most about you?" he commented one evening as we cooked supper together in my kitchen. "How you've taken something that could have made you bitter and turned it into growth instead." The apartment had truly become my home, filled with art and books that reflected my taste, adorned in colors that brought me delight. It was modest in comparison to what could have been mine if the trust had remained intact, but it was totally mine in a manner that the Gold Coast house would never have been. My cousin Sophia and I had developed a genuine friendship that had surprised us both. The artificial competition that had characterized our previous relationship had given way to mutual support and understanding, and she had even joined the board of the mentorship program, contributing both funds and connections. On the anniversary of the revelation, I hosted a small gathering at my apartment. Edward was there, looking fiercer than I'd like to admit, but still sharp as ever, as were Sophia and Jake, Claire, and a few close friends from work. My parents were noticeably absent, not because they weren't invited, but because they recognized that this was not a milestone they should be a part of. As we ate at my dining table, I felt an overwhelming sense of thankfulness for these folks who had become my chosen family. "A year ago I thought my life was destroyed," I said, raising my glass as a toast. "What I've learned since then is that when the foundation is revealed to be false, you have the opportunity to build something true in its place." Edward nodded in agreement, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "To truth," he simply whispered, raising his glass to meet mine. "To the truth," the others repeated. Later, after the visitors had left and only Jake remained to assist me in loading the dishwasher in peaceful stillness, I reflected on the deeper lessons of the previous year. Financial prosperity, while offering security and opportunity, was not the most valued currency. Trust, authenticity, and self-awareness were far more valuable and difficult to recover once damaged. I had learnt that forgiveness was a process that did not require forgetting or excusing but did eventually result in a lighter burden of wrath. Most importantly, I had learned that, while we cannot choose what happens to us, we do have complete control over how we respond and what we create from both gifts and wrecks. The betrayal would always be a part of my tale, a chapter that could not be erased, but it would not be the defining one. Rather, it was the one that compelled me to take charge of the narrative and write the remainder with purpose and honesty.